The first thing she noticed was not his height, but how the light refused to soften him. The morning sun fell across the yard in pale gold, touching cotton sacks, fence posts, and bowed heads with a gentle hand. Yet when it reached the new arrival, it seemed to stop short, as if unwilling to claim him. He stood motionless beside the wagon, chains loose around wrists thick as fence rails, his shadow stretching longer than it should have, darker than the rest. She felt her breath catch, an uninvited tightness in her chest, and for a moment she forgot to blink. She had seen strong men before. The plantation fed on them, broke them, replaced them. But this one was different. He did not hunch or avert his gaze. His eyes remained lowered, yes, but not in submission. It was the stillness of an animal aware of every sound, every movement, measuring distance and weight and outcome. When the overseer barked his name, the giant responded without flinching, his voice low and even, like earth shifting beneath roots. She told herself the unease was foolish. Size alone could not frighten her. And yet, as he was led away, she felt watched, not by his eyes, but by his attention, as though some part of him lingered behind, memorizing the house, the porch, the way she rested her hand against the column for balance. The sensation clung to her long after he vanished beyond the fields. That night, the dogs would not stop howling. Days passed, and the giant worked as ordered, lifting loads that took 3 men, moving with an efficiency that unsettled the others. He never complained, never begged, never rushed. When spoken to, he listened. When struck, he absorbed the blow as if cataloging it rather than feeling it. The other slaves avoided him, whispering that he smelled of iron and pine, that he walked too quietly for someone so large. One swore she saw him standing at the tree line after dusk, unmoving, head tilted, listening to something far deeper in the woods than crickets or owls. The mistress tried not to look for him, yet always seemed to find him at the edge of her vision. Once, from an upstairs window, she watched him skinning a deer brought in by the hunters. His hands moved with careful precision, reverent even, as though the act were not labor but ritual. He paused then, lifting his head slightly, and though he did not look directly at the house, she stepped back from the window, heart pounding, suddenly certain that he knew she was there. That night, the forest fell quiet. No dogs barked, no insects sang. The silence pressed against the walls, thick and suffocating, and for the first time since she had come to the plantation, the master's wife slept with the lamp lit, haunted by the certainty that something had entered their world that did not belong to chains and never truly had. She expected revulsion when she first heard of him, perhaps even curiosity, but fear was not something she had prepared for, and it arrived without permission the moment she saw him step down from the wagon. The yard had been noisy with orders and shifting feet, yet her attention, narrowed until all sound seemed to drain away, leaving only the slow creak of chains and the measured rhythm of his breathing. He was enormous, far larger than any man she had ever known, his shoulders broad enough to eclipse the overseer standing beside him. But it was not the size alone that unsettled her. It was the way he occupied space, as though the ground itself had adjusted to accommodate his weight, as though the air around him had learned to hold still. She watched from the shade of the veranda, fingers pressed lightly against the wood railing, telling herself that this was merely another purchase, another body added to the machinery that kept the estate alive. Yet her pulse betrayed her calm. His posture was wrong for a beaten man. There was no slump, no frantic energy, no desperate eagerness to please. He stood upright, balanced, his head slightly bowed, not in humility, but in attention, as if listening to something beneath the voices and commands. When the overseer snapped at him, The giant responded immediately, but without the flinch she had grown accustomed to seeing. It was the obedience of someone who understood the rules and had chosen, for now, to follow them. Her eyes lingered on his hands. They were scarred, old scars layered over older ones, the kind not made by whips or farm tools. She felt a chill then, a whisper of memory she could not place, something primal stirring beneath her reason. Hunter's hands, her mind offered unhelpfully, though she dismissed the thought at once. That was foolishness. This man was property now, bound by iron and law, stripped of whatever past he might have had. And yet, when he lifted his gaze for a brief moment, not to her but across the land itself, she felt as though he were measuring distances, noting cover and open ground, committing pathways to memory. She turned away too quickly, unsettled by the sensation that she had been assessed in return. All afternoon, the image of him lingered behind her eyes, intruding upon her routines, her conversations, her sense of order. She found herself listening for his footsteps, expecting to hear something heavy and clumsy, but instead imagining a tread far quieter than his sighs allowed. That night, as she prepared for bed, she realized her hands were trembling, not with disgust or outrage, but with an unease rooted deeper than thought, the kind that comes when instinct recognizes a danger the mind cannot yet name, a presence that does not belong to the role assigned to it, waiting patiently for the moment when watching would no longer be enough. At first the whispers were so faint they blended into the usual murmurs of the quarters, the low, cautious exchanges that floated through the night air like smoke and vanished just as easily. No one spoke his name aloud. They referred to him with gestures, with pauses in conversation, with averted eyes that flicked toward the tree line as though the land itself might be listening. The mistress noticed the change before she understood it, sensing a subtle tightening in the plantation's rhythms. Work still began at dawn and ended at dusk, yet something had shifted beneath the surface, an undercurrent of watchfulness that did not ease even in moments of rest. It began with his absence. A woman sent to fetch water at dawn swore. She passed his sleeping space and found it empty, the blanket folded with deliberate care, the ground beneath cool and undisturbed. Another claimed she heard movement beyond the fields deep into the night, not the frantic crashing of a runaway, but the measured passage of something moving with purpose. When questioned, they lowered their heads and shook with fear, insisting they had seen nothing, heard nothing. Yet their eyes betrayed them, wide and shining with an understanding they did not dare share openly. The mistress overheard fragments while walking the grounds, half-finished sentences that died when she approached, glances exchanged in silence. They spoke of how he did not sweat as others did, how he returned at dawn with his skin cold despite hours of labor, how his breath never seemed hurried, no matter how heavy the work. One man whispered that he had followed him once, curiosity overcoming caution, only to lose sight of the giant within moments, swallowed by the trees, as though the forest itself had opened to receive him. What unsettled her most was not the stories themselves, but their consistency. Fear often exaggerates, but these whispers aligned too neatly, repeating the same details in different voices, each account adding weight rather than confusion. They spoke of nights when the giant stood at the edge of the quarters silent, listening, not watching the people but the land beyond them. They said the animals sensed him, that mules grew restless when he passed and birds scattered from branches before he drew near. Even the dogs, fierce and trained, seemed reluctant to bark in his presence, their growls low and uncertain. As though recognizing something higher in the chain, they instinctively understood. She tried to dismiss the rumors as superstition, the product of fear feeding upon itself, yet she could not ignore the silence that followed him. On evenings when he returned late, the forest behind him seemed emptied of sound, the usual chorus of insects hushed as though something had passed through and claimed dominion. Once, unable to sleep, she rose and stood at the window, gazing toward the fields, and saw his silhouette emerging from the dark, carrying nothing, yet walking with the relaxed certainty of someone who had completed a task. He paused briefly, head tilted, as if listening to something she could not hear, then continued on without a backward glance. By morning, new stories had taken shape. A snare meant for rabbits lay shattered, the wire twisted as though wrenched apart by bare hands. A boar trap was found sprung, the bait untouched, the ground around it marked by deep impressions that suggested a struggle, yet no blood stained the earth. The men tasked with hunting spoke in uneasy tones, admitting they had found tracks they could not follow. Patterns that vanished abruptly as if the creature that made them had risen from the ground and taken to the air. The mistress felt the plantation drawing inward, people moving closer together, voices dropping, eyes scanning the edges of the woods. She sensed that the giant's presence had awakened something long buried, a memory of older laws written not by men, but by hunger and patience. In private moments, she wondered where he went at night, and what called to him beyond the fields. What knowledge he carried in his silence. The thought that unsettled her most was not that he might be plotting escape, but that he had no need to run, that he moved freely in a world within the plantation that no one else could see, learning its contours, its weaknesses, its living and breathing heart, while they slept believing themselves masters of a land that had already begun to answer to someone else. The dogs were the first to vanish, and their absence unsettled the plantation more deeply than any whispered rumor ever could. These were not ordinary animals but prized hunters, bred for aggression and obedience, trained to chase down anything that fled and tear apart anything that fought back. Their barking had always been a constant presence, a reminder of authority and control, echoing across the fields at dusk and greeting the dawn with sharp insistence. When one failed to return from the woods after an evening hunt, it was dismissed as misfortune, the kind that sometimes claimed even the strongest beasts. But when a second went missing, then a third, unease crept in, quiet and persistent. The master raged at first, blaming carelessness, threatening punishment, sending men into the forest to search. They returned with nothing but confusion etched into their faces. There were no broken branches, no blood trails, no signs of struggle that could explain the disappearances. The dogs had not fled, nor had they been dragged. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist beyond a certain point, the forest swallowing them whole without protest. Hunters who prided themselves on reading the land found themselves staring at disturbed soil that told no story they understood. As the days passed, the woods grew unnaturally still. The usual sounds of rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and distant animal calls faded, replaced by a silence that pressed against the ears. Even in daylight, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as though aware of an unseen presence moving within it. Birds abandoned familiar perches, and deer no longer ventured near the clearings. The men spoke of it in low voices, admitting they felt watched when they crossed the tree line, their instincts urging them to turn back even when pride told them to push forward. The mistress noticed the change in her husband's demeanor. His confidence, once loud and unshakable, thinned into irritation, and then into something closer to fear. He ordered traps set deeper, baited with fresh meat, and stationed armed men along the edges of the woods. Yet each morning brought new signs of failure. Traps were found dismantled with careful precision, springs released, mechanisms rendered useless without damage. One cage was discovered overturned, the iron bars bent outward, as if tested and rejected, the bait still resting inside, untouched. The loss of the dogs cut deeper than property. They had been symbols of dominance, living proof that nothing could move through the land without being hunted. Their absence shifted the balance in a way no one could articulate. Without their barking, night stretched longer and heavier, the darkness no longer broken by familiar sound. Men woke from sleep sweating, convinced they had heard footsteps where none should be, or felt breath on the back of their necks in the open air. It was during this time that attention turned toward the giant. Though no accusation was spoken aloud, he continued his work as before, calm and tireless, his expression unchanged. Yet the mistress observed small details that fed her growing dread. He returned from the fields without a scratch, his clothing sometimes damp with dew despite the heat of the day. Once, she saw him washing his hands at the pump long after sunset, the water running dark before clearing, though no blood was visible on his skin. When asked where he had been assigned that day, he answered plainly, naming a task that explained nothing and invited no further questions. The hunters ventured out again, determined to reclaim control, but they moved like men trespassing in unfamiliar territory. They found remains at last, not of dogs, but of something else. Bones stripped clean and arranged in a way that felt deliberate rather than random. No scavenger worked with such order. The pattern suggested patience, intelligence, and an understanding of fear. One man returned pale and shaking, confessing that he had heard breathing behind him while standing alone, slow and steady, close enough to feel warmth, yet when he turned, there was nothing. Gradually, the forest claimed a new authority. Paths once used without thought were avoided, and even the bravest men hesitated before entering the trees. The plantation's reach shrank inward, fields becoming islands surrounded by an unseen threat. The mistress realized then that the dogs had not been lost or killed in chaos. They had been removed, deliberately and methodically, like sentries taken out before a larger movement. Whatever now ruled the woods understood hierarchy and strategy, and it had begun by silencing the loudest guardians, teaching the land to listen to a new master, one who moved unseen and left behind only the echo of fear where barking once reigned. The master's temper had always been a tool sharper than any whip, and when a body was found sprawled in the yard, broken, lifeless, yet strangely unmarred, he saw it not as a mystery, but as an affront to his authority. The victim had been careless, wandering too far in the shadow of the woods where whispers said the giant sometimes moved. And now the master demanded retribution. The overseer called for the giant, and when he appeared, he did so without hesitation, stepping from the shadows as though the summons had been expected all along. There was no tremor in his shoulders, no hesitation in his stride. Yet every eye in the yard, including the mistress's, lingered on him with a mixture of fascination and unease. The punishment was to be severe. Chains were fastened with extra care, ropes tied in intricate knots, meant to humiliate as well as restrain. The master ordered blows delivered with precision, men trained in cruelty moving like surgeons of pain, their strikes landing where they would hurt most, and yet the giant absorbed them, as though the pain were a physical weight to be cataloged rather than felt. The whip's lash raised lines across his skin, but they faded unnaturally fast, leaving only the impression that something immense was coiled beneath, untouched by ordinary suffering. Those who struck him whispered that it was like hitting a tree, solid and unyielding, yet alive in a way that terrified them. The yard fell into a peculiar hush as the spectacle continued. The other slaves watched, their fear mingled with awe. because punishment had always served to reinforce human hierarchies, but here it only highlighted the impossibility of subjugation. The giant's eyes did not waver. They held a quiet scrutiny, noting every motion, every intention, every pulse of energy directed toward him. Even the master's face, flushed with anger and authority, seemed diminished beneath the calm weight of the man's observation. It was as if the punishment was not a correction but a lesson, and those watching were students in a class they could barely comprehend. When the blows ceased, he stood upright without complaint, chains falling loosely from his wrists, and the master realized too late that endurance alone did not make a man submissive. There was a deliberateness in his movements, a precision that suggested control far beyond that of a mere laborer. Every twitch of muscle, every measured breath, spoke of someone accustomed to restraint, someone who understood the power of timing and patience. The giant's silence was not compliance, it was calculation, and for the first time, the master sensed that he had underestimated the scope of what he was facing. The mistress, who had been forced to witness the scene from the veranda, felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. There was no cruelty in the giant's reaction, yet no ignorance either. He did not flinch, cry, or plead. He absorbed, cataloged, and remained perfectly composed. In that moment, she began to understand something that she had refused to see before. That his obedience, such as it appeared, was chosen, not demanded. It was a performance of compliance, a careful measure of power restrained until the right time. As the days that followed stretched onward, subtle changes became apparent. The master tried to test him further, ordering heavier labor, assigning impossible tasks meant to break him, yet the giant completed each with the same controlled efficiency. His body, though enormous, moved without excess, every action deliberate. When questioned, he answered plainly, never offering excuses, never seeking approval, and never betraying the internal calculation that seemed to govern every motion. The other slaves began to whisper again, this time in awed tones, hinting that punishment had not revealed weakness, but had exposed a hidden strength that no whip, no chain could touch. The master's frustration deepened, and so did his fear, though he could not name it. His authority, once unquestioned, seemed fragile in comparison to the calm presence of the man he had attempted to break. Even those who had never spoken directly to the giant sensed it. The weight of something beyond comprehension. A predator disguised as laborer, watching, learning, waiting. And the mistress, in her quiet moments, realized that this was no ordinary punishment, no ordinary endurance, and that the man's patience was not mere compliance, but a warning, a signal that the balance of control had shifted in ways she could barely imagine. The truth revealed itself not in a single moment, but in small, insistent pieces, each one layering upon the last until the mistress could no longer ignore it. She had begun to notice the patterns, the subtle shifts in the plantation's rhythm that coincided with the giant's presence. Tasks once completed with effort now unfolded under his hands as though the land itself had yielded willingly. Animals behaved differently, reacting to him with respect or fear, and the other slaves moved cautiously around him, deferential but uncertain. It was not the obedience of fear alone. It was a recognition of something more profound, something innate and unspoken. One evening, she saw him at the tree line again, standing perfectly still as the wind stirred the branches around him. His eyes did not scan for danger or opportunity in the way the others did. They measured, calculated, and cataloged. He tilted his head slightly, listening to a language that the plantation's inhabitants could neither hear nor understand, a rhythm that pulsed beneath the ordinary sounds of the land. The realization struck her then, sharp and terrible. This was no man who simply endured. This was a hunter, one who had observed and studied long before the chains were fastened to his wrists, one who understood the prey and the predator in ways that humans rarely do. Her mind raced back over all the signs she had ignored or rationalized. The vanished dogs, the silence in the forest, the precision with which he had endured punishment. It all fit. Each act she had interpreted as submission, as the passive endurance of a captive, was instead a patient exercise in preparation. He had allowed them to underestimate him, to mistake restraint for weakness, all the while learning the patterns of their fear, the boundaries of their authority, and the vulnerabilities of their environment. She remembered the way he had handled the hunting tools brought in by the overseers, the careful, almost reverent motions with which he skinned and cleaned the animals. That day, she had thought him merely efficient, skilled in ways useful to the plantation. Now she understood the duality of those skills. They were not for labor alone, but for survival and mastery, tools honed over a lifetime for the silent pursuit of something larger than obedience. Every motion, every glance, every small act of compliance was calculated to ensure that no one would suspect the truth, until it was far too late. Even the other slaves seemed to sense the shift before she did. They whispered with awe and caution, their words fragmented and hurried, acknowledging a knowledge they dared not speak aloud. They had begun to call him a shadow among men, a presence that could not be pinned down, an unseen force moving through the plantation with purpose. They knew what she had only begun to grasp, that his history, his skill, and his endurance were not the marks of a simple laborer, but of a hunter in the truest sense, one attuned to the weaknesses of those around him and capable of acting with precision when the time came. The mistress's fear deepened as the pattern became undeniable. She traced in her mind the nights he had disappeared into the woods, the hunts he had survived unscathed, the silence that fell when he walked among the animals and the men alike. The giant was never prey, she realized, nor had he ever been property. His compliance, his stillness, the endurance he had displayed under whip and chain, all had been deliberate exercises in concealment. He had bided his time, learning the land, the people, and the ways in which they wielded power, all while masking the keen intelligence that now revealed itself to her in pieces she could not unsee. And then, the dread settled fully in her chest. She understood that the giant's patience was not passive, it was strategy. He had watched cruelty with the eyes of someone who knew how it worked, how it left patterns and weaknesses behind, and how the prey, whether animal or human, could be understood and predicted. The chains had bound his body but not his mind, and every step he had taken in obedience had been a step closer to mastery of the world that had sought to contain him. She began to see the plantation differently, not as a place of unquestioned authority and security, but as a landscape already mapped by someone who had never belonged to it, someone whose skills, patience, and knowledge would outlast any human attempt to dominate him, and whose next movements would be as deliberate and unstoppable as a predator finally revealing itself to the unsuspecting.